Guys, so today let's talk about your rights. All right. I know I'm usually talking about security topics, and I've gotten into some employment talks and discussions on my channel now about labor laws. Let's talk about your rights as a citizen in the United States. All right. Now, everybody refers to the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments in the United States Constitution, which states not all of your rights, but what is considered some of the more important inherent rights that guarantee your freedom as a citizen in the United States. Now, in particular, one of the hot topics going around is your Second Amendment right. Your Second Amendment right, everybody is saying, is your right to keep and bear arms. That's just a small portion of the actual Second Amendment. The full amendment in the Constitution for your right to keep and bear arms is a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay. So let's just think about that for a second. Alright, it's not your right to keep and bear arms to protect you against another private citizen. That is strictly stating basically this. Alright, you cannot disarm the citizens of these states because in the event that the government of the United States becomes tyrannical, the citizens have the right to keep and bear arms to overthrow that government. And essentially, what's going on in the political world today is they're talking about taking away everybody's rights for this firearm and that firearm, and oh well, the citizens can't have this firearm because it's too close to this military firearm. Well, if you're doing that, you're kind of limiting the citizens' ability to fight off the military in the event that the government decides to use the military against the citizens. Pushing all aside all the federal laws that they have on the books that pretty much go against that. So, the oldest law in the book that says anything about using the military against the citizens that I can think of is the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, basically what the Posse Comitatus Act states is that the government cannot use the military as a law enforcement arm to enforce its laws on the citizens of the United States. It can't. And that goes to all the branches of the military except for one. Now, I know I'm going to have people out there saying all four branches, but one. So only three branches it applies to. No. 4 branches it applies to, and there's one that isn't technically considered a branch of the military, but it is. And that's the Coast Guard. Back when the Posse Comitatus Act came out, you didn't have an Air Force. At that time, you had 3 branches of the military for the United States. You had the Continental Navy, the Continental Army, and the Continental Marines, which now today is the United States Navy, United States Army, and United States Marine Corps. Now, the United States Marine Corps answers to the Navy. The United States Army and the United States Navy answer to the Secretary of the Army and the Navy, who answers to the President. The United States Air Force, this law applies to because originally it was not the United States Air Force. It was the United States Army Air Corps. And then in the late 1940s, early 1950s, somewhere in that time span, the United States Army Air Force at that time split from the Army and became its own branch of the military. So there's 4. Now, the Coast Guard is a different story. While during times of war, it is a part of the Department of Defense, which is the military in the United States. And during times of war, the Coast Guard answers to the Secretary of the Navy. So the Department of the Navy is what it falls under during times of war. During times of peace, like we are right now, because we're not in an official war, back when it first became the Coast Guard, when they merged the United States Cutter Service and the United States Life Saving Service and created the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard answered to the Department of Transportation during times of peace, Department of the Navy during times of war. Now the Coast Guard is under the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Transportation. And so during times of peace, the Commandant of the Coast Guard answers to the Secretary of Homeland Security. The Cutter Service enforced tariffs and pretty much kind of like customs enforcement at seaports in the United States. And they also did vessel escorts into harbors and all that stuff. The Life Saving Service was basically the United States Coast Guard. Well, not Coast Guard, but lifeguards. And basically, they were members of the Life Saving Service who were on a stretch of beach, and they would, get the general public out of the water during times of dangerous conditions. They would do rescue swimmer type activities like you see in the movie The Guardian. Except instead of jumping out of a helicopter, they're literally jumping into the ocean from the beach and swimming out, grabbing a person and dragging them back to shore. Or in a boat that you had actual oars to paddle out through the surf to get to a person and put them in that boat and then paddle the boat back to the beach. And then they started taking on these enforcement roles eventually once they became the full-fledged United States Coast Guard. So they do enforcement activities they're allowed to by U.S. law on the citizens of the United States, because technically during times of peace they're not a military entity. The Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Army, on the other hand, completely different story. 100% during times of peace, 100% during times of war. They're 100% military. And going to our Second Amendment right, the Posse Comitatus Act would be the most relevant that I can think of that would apply. Back during the Obama administration, you had President Obama wanting to take away pretty much most of the gun rights of the citizens, and saying he would use any means necessary pretty much to enforce this. There was talk of him using the local law enforcement and federal law enforcement agencies to do this. And then there was talk of him nationalizing the National Guard and using the National Guard soldiers, people that answer to the Department of Defense when they're in their military uniform, to enforce an actual law or executive order that he was going to push onto the citizens of the United States. This is where the Posse Comitatus Act comes into play, because legally he wouldn't be allowed to do that, because the Posse Comitatus Act from the 1700s, from the end of the 1700s, when this law was created, prevented him from doing that. He couldn't. Let's never mind the responses that the military turned around and was quoted as to say, because there were people in the military, full-time active duty, not National Guard part-time and reservists, full-time active duty people in the military that were saying not only would they not give their soldiers that order, and not only would their soldiers highly go against them, but there was quotes of people saying that were military members, active duty, that if their commanding officers gave them that order, that they would disarm their commanding officers and they would revolt against the president. Now, on top of that, had that happened, there is another federal law involving the military that limits the size and scope of the military. So that the United States military cannot have a larger group of military men and women, soldiers, airmen, seamen, Marines, than the population of the United States. On top of that, it further goes and breaks it down into the states, that the states can't have a militia bigger than the population of that said state. And there is an actual number attached. If I'm not mistaken, it's either 1/3 or 2/3 of the population. I'm pretty sure it's 1/3. Don't quote me on that. It's been a while since I read that one. But they can't have a standing army ready to fight the population of the United States any bigger than X amount of the population. It's a fraction of the population. Had President Obama went through with that, and had the military members not said no, but hell no, and they actually went through with the order, this country would be in a civil war. And here's the bad part. There's no way that it would end on a good note. It would end. But after how much bloodshed? Brothers fighting brothers. Just like back when the Civil War happened in the 1860s. So much bloodshed. Family member against family member. Friend against friend. All because of all these different views. Would it end like the Civil War did? Probably not. Because with the way the population is nowadays, you have so many people against taking away people's rights, which is essentially what the government is doing with quite a few of the laws in the country. You see, your Second Amendment right says shall not be infringed. There's no exception. But let's look at some laws. The federal government has made it a criminal act that if you are convicted of a violent or nonviolent crime, whether a felony or misdemeanor, they can take away your rights. Think about it. Alright? Now, I'm not saying give someone who has shot somebody a gun. But the Constitution says, shall not be infringed. There is no exception to it at all. But yet the federal government has made a law that says, oh, well, you were convicted of this crime, and we think you shouldn't have a firearm. Now, if a right is infringible, or can't be infringed upon, as it says in the Constitution, how is it legal for the government to infringe on a right because of a crime you committed? All too often, for a little bit of safety, you, the general public, decide that, hey, I'm willing to give this up as long as this group can't get this right. Guess what? Guys, we're heading down a rabbit hole of tyranny like you would not believe. Think about all these people out here on YouTube that go to these police stations. They go to the federal buildings. They stand on the sidewalk outside courthouses. They literally stand on the public right-of-way on the side of the road, safe away from traffic, and film cops. And then the cops arrest them because photography is a crime. It's a First Amendment protected activity. Better yet, nowhere in the First Amendment for the freedom of the press does it state that the government can say who is or who isn't a member of the press. But yet, and here's an active case, Mr. J.C. Playford, who has been denied access to press conferences because someone in the San Diego County Sheriff's Office doesn't like him or makes the San Diego Sheriff's deputies look bad because he got video of something that they did that they shouldn't have. And they're saying, well, we're not denying him access because of that. We're denying him access because he doesn't have a government-issued press credential. Again, where in the Constitution does it say that press means someone with a government-issued press credential? Back when that constitutional right came out in the First Amendment, who were the press? It wasn't people that the government wanted to be the press. It was everyday Joe Schmo like me and you. Think about that. Essentially, a member of the press is someone recording news activity that is of interest to the public. It's a public citizen. It's a citizen of the United States recording matters that are of interest to the citizens of the United States. I could be a press member. You could be a press member. You don't have to have press credentials. But look at it like it is. Look at all these big press and media corporations. NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox. The list goes on and on. And general members of the public are now being told, you're not a member of the press unless you work for this agency and you have this pass that we issue. I'm sorry, folks, but that's not how the Constitution works. The Constitution is basically a contract that says you're the government, we the people put you there. We the people can take you out of those positions, and by the way, we want at least these rights guaranteed, and these are not all of our rights. These are just the ones we consider the most important inherent rights, and you cannot infringe on any of our rights, even the ones that are not written in the Constitution. Now, there's going to be people out there that's going, well, you know, I have this right and this right and this right, and the government's going to tell you, nope, it's a privilege. Well, there are privileges, but then there are rights. Read the Declaration of Independence. You have certain unalienable rights. And this is not the word for word, but basically what it says after that is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's not all. It says, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, let's take a look at some other things in another video, and we can talk on those. For instance, how much of a right does the government have to come onto your private property and tell you just because your car has a flat tire, they're going to take your car? We'll talk about that in the next video. Think about what I said today, guys, and I'll see you next time.